She was 62 years old, standing before a cabin that had no heat, no running water, and a roof that bowed in the middle like something that had already surrendered. Everything she owned fit inside the trunk of a 15-year-old sedan. Her husband of 4 decades had walked out for a woman half his age, and he'd made certain the court left Linda with nothing of value. The cabin was his parting mockery, a heap of rotting logs in the Colorado mountains that even he had forgotten he owned. He laughed when she pulled out of the driveway. He was convinced she would simply vanish. But what Richard never grasped, what not a single one of them grasped, was that Linda and that cabin shared something no one bothered to see. The world had discarded them both. Everyone assumed there was nothing left inside either one worth fighting for. Every last one of them was wrong. If you believe no woman carries an expiration date, and that justice finds its way home, no matter how long the road, subscribe to follow a comeback that will settle something deep inside your chest. Linda Harrison had been 62 for exactly 3 weeks the morning her entire world cracked open. She'd spent that morning the way she spent most, standing in the kitchen of the suburban house she had tended for 4 decades. Coffee brewing, dinner already taking shape in her mind. A meal for a husband who hadn't truly tasted her cooking in years. The house was spotless. It was always spotless. 40 years Linda had given to the craft of keeping that home alive, raising 2 children who grew up and built lives of their own. Standing beside Richard, a commercial real estate developer who moved through the world like it owed him something. She had done everything right. At least that's what she believed. The signs had been there. She understood that later, looking back with clear eyes. The late nights at the office that stretched longer and longer. A new cologne she never bought him. The gym membership that appeared out of nowhere. Business trips that multiplied like lies, stacking on top of each other. But Linda had trusted him. 40 years of marriage should build a foundation strong enough to hold. Shouldn't it? Trust is the slowest thing a person can build, and the fastest thing the world can shatter. That morning Richard came downstairs wearing a suit she had never seen, expensive, tailored close to the body, younger than anything he usually wore. Quote _0 __, he said. His eyes aimed somewhere past her shoulder. Linda's stomach dropped straight through the floor. 40 years beside a man teaches you to hear what lives underneath his words. This wasn't about the house. This wasn't about a trip. This was something else entirely. They sat in the living room, the room Linda had decorated and stripped and decorated again across the decades. The room where Christmas mornings unfolded, where birthday candles got blown out, where their children took first steps across the carpet. Richard sat across from her, not beside her. That single detail, the distance he chose, would stay lodged in Linda's chest for months. 4 decades together, and he picked the chair farthest away. His voice was flat, rehearsed. The words landed like fists against her ribs, one after the other. That was all she could push out. Quote 4, quote 5, quote 6. He cut her off without flinching. Quote 7, 32. The number hung in the air between them like smoke. Linda whispered. The cruelty of it pressed the air from her lungs. He'd provided, as if her 40 years of running that household, raising those children, propping up his career, charming his clients, keeping his world polished and presentable, meant absolutely nothing. 40 years. Gone, in a sentence. I want you out of the house by the end of the week, Richard continued. My lawyer will be in touch about the divorce proceedings. And that was it. He stood up, walked out, headed to the office, or maybe to Carla. Didn't look back. Linda sat alone in the living room. She had turned into a home with her own hands, and understood that the life she'd known was finished. What followed was months of humiliation dressed up as legal process. Richard's lawyers moved like wolves. Every asset, they argued, existed because of Richard's labor. The house, purchased with his income. The cars, his earnings. The retirement accounts, his career. Linda had been a homemaker. They said that word like it meant nothing. They repeated it. She had contributed no financial value to the marriage. The fact that she'd made Richard's career possible by managing everything else, the house, the meals, the children, the schedules, the social obligations. The fact that she'd buried her own ambitions so his could breathe. The fact that she had been his partner in every sense that mattered. None of it registered in the cold arithmetic of divorce court. Their children, Michael and Jessica, tried to stay neutral. They loved both parents. They didn't want to choose sides. But neutrality, when your mother is drowning, feels like watching from the shore. Linda faced this alone. The final hearing landed on a grey morning in November. Linda sat in the courtroom beside a court-appointed lawyer. She couldn't afford her own. Across the aisle, Richard sat flanked by his legal team, and by Carla. Carla was everything Linda was not. Young, blonde, wearing a dress that cost more than Linda's monthly budget. She touched Richard's arm like she owned it, smiled up at him adoringly. Linda felt herself vanishing. The judge, looking bored, read through the settlement. Richard would keep the house, the cars, most of the retirement accounts. Linda would receive a modest monthly alimony for 5 years. Enough time to get on her feet, the judge said. As if a 62-year-old woman, discarded after 4 decades of marriage, could simply start fresh. As if that's how the world worked. There is one additional property, Richard's lawyer said, almost as an afterthought. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 1, 4, underscore, underscore, underscore. Richard leaned toward his lawyer, whispered something. They both smirked. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 1, 5, underscore, underscore, underscore. Linda's lawyer looked at her, eyebrows raised. Linda had nothing left, nothing to bargain with, nothing to protect. Fine, she said quietly. The gavel came down. The marriage was over. As Linda walked out of the courtroom, she heard Richard's laugh trailing behind her. Quote, 17, quote. He called out. Quote, 18, quote. Carla giggled. Linda kept walking, kept her spine straight, kept her chin up, refused to let them watch her break. She made it to her car, then the tears came. She sat in the courthouse parking lot. 62 years old, divorced, nearly destitute, nowhere to go. Nothing in her name except the deed to a worthless property her ex-husband had handed her as one last humiliation. A punchline, a parting joke. This was her life now. This was where 40 years of devotion led, to mockery and an abandoned cabin in the mountains that nobody wanted. Linda spent her final week in the house, packing what remained of her existence. Richard had generously allowed her 7 days to dismantle 4 decades of life. She packed what the old sedan could hold, her clothes, photographs, a handful of furniture pieces that predated the marriage. Everything else remained. The home she'd spent decades shaping, the life she'd assembled with her own hands, stitch by stitch, all of it left behind for Richard and Carla. Her neighborhood friends offered polite words and careful distance. Divorce made people uncomfortable. They didn't know where to stand. Sam took Richard's side, believed the story that Linda had simply stopped trying, that she'd grown dull. Others felt sorry for her, but kept that sympathy at arm's length, the kind that never quite reaches you. Linda could feel herself fading, shrinking into exactly what Richard had described. 62 years old, cast off, broke. She'd become the woman people spoke about in lowered voices, the one they pitied, but couldn't figure out how to hold. Michael called. Jessica called. Both offered spare rooms. And Linda heard it, the hesitation threaded through their kindness. The careful way they said, underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 19, underscore, underscore, underscore. The unspoken worry about their own routines, their own families, the disruption a displaced mother would bring. Her children loved her, she never doubted that. But love and room are different things. They were deep inside lives of their own. She would be weight they hadn't asked to carry. I have the cabin, Linda told them. I'll go there for a while, sort myself out. "Mum, that place is a dump." Jessica didn't soften it. The bitterness crept out before she could catch it. 3 hours north, deep into the Colorado mountains. Linda had never laid eyes on the place. Richard inherited it from his father 2 decades back and dismissed it without a second thought. Too far from anything, too broken down, worth nothing except a line on a tax return. But it had walls, probably a roof, and it carried her name now. On a bitter December morning, she loaded the last box into her car and pulled away from the only home she'd known in her adult life. She did not turn around. She did not glance at the mirror. The road unraveled beneath her. Paved highway gave way to county blacktop. County blacktop gave way to gravel. Gravel gave way to a rutted dirt track, barely visible beneath brush that had spent years swallowing the path whole. She nearly drove past the turnoff. A bleached wooden sign, "Harrison Property, no trespassing." The irony landed heavy. She'd been trespassing in her own life for 40 years. When the cabin finally appeared, Linda killed the engine and sat, just sat, hands on the wheel, staring. Richard had called it dilapidated. He'd been generous. A small log structure, maybe 800 square feet. The porch had buckled on one side, boards hanging like broken teeth, windows shattered. The roof dipped in the center, a slow, tired surrender to gravity. Vines had claimed the walls. Moss blanketed what the vines hadn't reached. It looked like something abandoned by the living, not a home, a ruin. She thought about Jessica's spare room, Michael's spare room. She thought about turning the car around, driving back down that rutted track, admitting she was exactly what Richard believed her to be. Then she remembered his laugh in the courtroom, Carla's voice, that bright, careless giggle. The way they'd handed her this property like a punchline, fully expecting the joke to break her. _25, quote. She said it out loud. To herself, to the trees, to no one. She stepped out. Mountain air hit her face, cold, sharp, thick with pine, and silence. No engines, no voices, no neighbors, just wind moving through branches, and somewhere far off, a single bird calling. After months of courtrooms and whispers and humiliation, the silence pressed against her like something holy. She crossed the overgrown yard slowly, tested each porch step with one foot before trusting it with her weight. The front door was locked, but the wood framing the latch had rotted so deeply that one hard push splintered it open. The smell reached her before her eyes adjusted. Mold, decay, the sharp tang of animal droppings layered over years of nothing, years of no one. Inside was worse than outside. One large room with a cramped kitchen corner, a stone fireplace, and a loft overhead that must have served as the bedroom. Dust and wreckage blanketed every surface. Rain had poured through holes in the roof for years. The wood floor had rotted clean through in spots. Unlivable. And exactly what she needed. Linda stood in the center of that ruin and felt something rise inside her she hadn't felt in months. Not sadness, not exhaustion. Anger. Pure, blazing, righteous anger. At what had been done to her. At how casually she'd been thrown away. At this final humiliation, dressed up as property. 26. She said aloud, to the empty cabin, to Richard, to every person who had pitied her or written her off. That first night, Linda broke. She sat on the filthy floor with a sleeping bag she'd packed, no heat, no light but the beam of a flashlight, and she let herself shatter. 40 years of marriage. 40 years of pouring herself into someone else's life, and this was where it led. A 62-year-old woman sitting alone in a rotting cabin, discarded like something used up and tossed aside. But when morning came, Linda dried her face. She stood. She got to work. She wasn't dead. She wasn't finished. And she would burn before she gave Richard Harrison the satisfaction of knowing he'd destroyed her. That first week was pure survival. She had some money, not much. The alimony wouldn't arrive for another month. But there was a small savings account Richard had never known about. She spent it on the bare essentials: a camping stove, jugs of water, cleaning supplies, work gloves, trash bags. The closest town sat 40 minutes down the mountain, a tiny community with one general store, one gas station, one diner. The people there watched her with quiet curiosity. A woman her age, clearly not passing through, loading up on bleach and moving boxes. Linda offered no explanation. She didn't want their sympathy. She didn't need their opinions. Back at the cabin, she started with what mattered most. She could not live with the stench and the filth. Everything else could wait. The broken walls, the sagging beams, the leaking sky above her head. But she could make it clean. She forced open the windows that still moved. December mountain air cut through the cabin like a blade. She began filling trash bags, old newspapers, animal nests, furniture rotted past recognition, things she couldn't even name. The work was brutal. Linda hadn't done anything like this in decades. Her back screamed, her hands, soft from years of gentle housework, blistered on the first day, cracked on the second. She stopped constantly, out of breath, muscles shaking. She wasn't 25. She wasn't even 45. She was 62, and her body made sure she never forgot it. But she kept going. There was something almost sacred in the labor. Every bag of filth she dragged out the door was a piece of her old life leaving. Every surface she scrubbed raw was a small, quiet victory. By the end of that first week, the cabin stood empty of debris. Still ruined, floor still soft with rot, roof still open to the rain, walls still scarred with mold and water damage, but it was clean ruin, and clean ruin was progress. The second week, Linda went after the mold. She drove into town for industrial cleaner and a respirator mask from the hardware store. The clerk behind the counter, a man in his 50s, name tag reading Tom, actually spoke to her, Linda said. The words came out before she could stop them. Tom paused, looked at her differently, not with pity, but with something closer to respect. __quote _30__. Linda spent days on those walls, respirator strapped tight, arms burning from the same motion over and over. The mold had burrowed deep into the grain in places. Those sections were beyond saving. They'd need to come out entirely. Linda had no clue how to do that, not the faintest idea. But she could scrub what was scrubbable. So she scrubbed. It was in what used to be the kitchen, a particularly vicious patch of mold, black and stubborn, clinging to the wall like it owned the place. Linda was working at it with everything she had when she heard it. Or rather, didn't hear it. The wall sounded wrong. She stopped, knocked again. Hollow. She shifted her knuckles to the wall beside it. Solid. Back to the first spot. Hollow. Unmistakably hollow. She leaned closer. The boards here weren't quite the same as the rest. Something about their age, or the way they'd been fitted, slightly off, like someone had put them in at a different time, with a different purpose. She didn't plan what happened next. Curiosity pulled her forward, curiosity and maybe the raw need for something, anything, to break the grey monotony of this work. The crowbar was already in her hand. She'd been using it on rotted floorboards all morning. She wedged the flat edge into a seam between the boards. The wood was soft from years of moisture. It gave without a fight. Behind it, a space. Not large, maybe 2 feet deep, 3 feet across, stretching from floor to ceiling. A hidden compartment built into the wall itself. Linda's pulse climbed into her throat. Someone had constructed this on purpose. Someone had concealed this deliberately. What would a person hide inside the bones of a cabin? She aimed her flashlight into the gap. There, resting at the bottom, sat a wooden box, about the size of a large shoebox. Cedar. And despite the damp that had destroyed nearly everything else in this building, the box was remarkably intact. Cedar resists rot. Cedar resists insects. That's what had kept it whole while the cabin crumbled around it. Linda lifted it out with both hands, heavier than she expected. She lowered herself to the floor, the box in her lap, fingers trembling. This was someone's secret, placed here with intention. Richard's father, Richard's grandfather, or someone who'd held this land long before the Harrison name ever touched it. She opened the lid. Inside, wrapped carefully in oilcloth, bundles of papers, and beneath them, a cloth bag. Linda reached for the papers first, unfolded them slowly. They were deeds, old deeds, and as her eyes moved across the faded ink, line by line, her heart began to hammer against her ribs. This cabin, these 20 acres of land everyone had written off as worthless, they hadn't always been nothing. In 1875, the property had been filed as a mineral claim, specifically a claim on a natural hot spring. The documents laid it out clearly. The spring had been discovered in 1874. Water samples had been tested and found rich with minerals, the kind long believed to carry healing properties. The owner had drawn up plans, real plans, engineering sketches for a bathhouse, correspondence with investors who wanted in, a vision for something real, a mineral spa built around what the earth itself was offering. And then, dated 1876, a final entry. Development postponed indefinitely due to economic panic. Will return to project when circumstances allow. Circumstances never allowed. The owner died. The property drifted from hand to hand. Eventually, it landed with Richard's grandfather, who almost certainly never knew what lay beneath his feet. The spring, if it still existed, if it was still flowing somewhere under this neglected ground. A natural mineral spring with documented healing properties. That wasn't nothing. That was the foundation beneath spa resorts across the entire world. Linda's hands wouldn't stop shaking as she set the papers aside and reached for the cloth bag. She loosened the drawstring. Inside, rock samples presumably gathered from the area surrounding the spring, and one small glass bottle, carefully labeled, sealed tight with wax. Spring water, preserved like evidence, like proof. Linda sat on the cold floor of a cabin that was falling apart around her, ruin in every direction, mold on the walls, rot in the boards, and in her lap a cedar box holding history, and something that felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, like possibility. The property Richard had thrown at her like garbage, his parting insult, his final act of contempt, might actually hold something extraordinary. Linda started laughing, then sobbing, then laughing again, the sounds tangling together until she couldn't tell which was which. He had been so certain, so smugly, perfectly certain that he was handing her nothing, a worthless scrap of land to match what he believed she was worth. But he'd handed her the raw material for a completely different life. The irony cut so deep it drew blood. That night, Linda drove back into town with something she hadn't carried in months. Purpose. Real, sharp, burning purpose. She needed the internet. She needed answers. The diner had Wi-Fi, so she ordered coffee, cracked open her laptop, and started digging. Mineral springs, historical spa resorts, property development across Colorado. What she found was thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. Natural mineral springs, properly developed, held genuine value. Spa resorts built around them pulled in millions annually. But development demanded capital, permits, environmental studies, infrastructure, not the kind of thing a 62-year-old woman with dwindling savings could simply will into existence, unless she kept looking, and she did. Historical properties, she discovered, sometimes qualified for grants, preservation funds. If she could document the historical significance of that mineral spring, if she could prove the original development plans were real, funding might exist to restore the site. A long shot, a razor-thin thread of possibility, but long shots were the only currency Linda had left, and she was ready to spend every one. Over the weeks that followed, obsession took root. During daylight hours, she kept working on the cabin, making it livable. She learned to patch a leaking roof, pried out rotted boards and replaced them, installed a wood stove so the cold wouldn't hollow her out at night. Her classroom was a screen propped on a dusty table, video after video on home repair, carpentry, plumbing. Her palms thickened with calluses. Her arms grew dense with new muscle. Work she never imagined doing, work that left her body screaming by sundown. And work that filled her with something she hadn't felt in years, the raw, undeniable proof that her hands could still build. But the spring owned her thoughts. She had to find it, had to confirm it was still alive beneath the earth, still flowing after all these decades. The old deeds gave approximate coordinates, but 150 years had redrawn the landscape. Trees had swallowed clearings, soil had shifted. She spent hours crossing her 20 acres on foot, scanning for clues, unusual patches of green, moisture where there shouldn't be any, anything hinting at water hidden below. January came, 3 months since she'd first stepped into that cabin. 3 months of cold mornings and aching joints and silence so thick it pressed against her chest. And then, a clearing she'd walked past a dozen times before. Unremarkable, forgettable. Except on this day, with snow blanketing everything white, she noticed something wrong. A bare spot, maybe 10 feet across. Snow melted faster there, the ground exposed, dark, breathing, warmth, rising from below. Linda grabbed a shovel. 1 foot down, moisture. 2 feet down, water began pooling in the hole. Warm water, rising steadily, filling the space her hands had opened. She'd found it. The spring was real, active, flowing in the exact location the old deeds had promised. Linda knelt in the snow beside that rough, muddy hole, her knees soaked through, her fingers numb, and she cried. Not the way she'd cried those first weeks, not from loss or loneliness or the crushing weight of being thrown away. She cried from relief, from gratitude so fierce it shook her whole body. Richard had tried to discard her. He'd flung this property at her feet like something rotten, but buried inside it was a path forward, and she had uncovered it with her own hands. That evening, for the first time in weeks, Linda picked up the phone and called her children. Quote 31, quote, she told them. Quote 32, quote. She described the spring, the historical documents, her plans, rough, ambitious, enormous plans. Michael's voice went flat with skepticism. Mom, be realistic. Developing a spa resort? That takes millions of dollars. Just watch me, Linda cut him off. The words came out steady, certain, like stone. Jessica was gentler, more careful. But the worry bled through. Mom, don't get your hopes up too high. Even if the spring turned out to be real, actually building something from it, that was another mountain entirely. I know it's hard, I know the odds are stacked against me, but for the first time since the divorce, I feel alive. I feel like there's a reason to wake up in the morning. I'm not asking for help. I'm just telling you what I've chosen to do. From divorce to discovery, one woman's mountain miracle. That was the headline. The piece laid out everything. The divorce, the property everyone called worthless, the hidden documents, the transformation of the land, and the woman who refused to let it stay dead. Photos accompanied the article. Linda studied those images and almost didn't recognize the person staring back. 20 pounds had come off her frame, not from dieting, from hauling stone, from digging, from work that broke her body open and rebuilt it into something harder. Her face was tanned and lined deep by sun and wind, but alive. Alive in a way it hadn't been for years. Her grey hair, she'd stopped colouring it months ago, was pulled into a practical bun. Jeans, flannel shirt, work boots caped in mountain mud. Nothing remained of the suburban housewife she'd been. The woman in those photographs had built something with her own 2 hands. She looked powerful. The article sent ripples nobody expected. Investors called, spa consultants offered their services, and women wrote to her. Dozens of them, strangers pouring out stories of their own divorces, their own reinventions, their own moments of standing at the bottom and choosing to climb. Linda hadn't set out to become a symbol of anything. She'd been trying to survive, trying to piece together a life from what was left after everything had been stripped away. But her story landed somewhere deep in people who recognized themselves in it. In November, exactly 1 year after the divorce was finalized, a letter arrived from Richard's lawyer. Richard was requesting a meeting. He wanted to discuss the property. Linda burned the letter. 2 days later, Richard himself appeared. Linda was outside working alongside contractors, handling final details on the bathhouse construction. She saw his expensive car lurching up the rutted mountain road, suspension scraping against rock and root. Her stomach clenched tight. A full year since she'd last laid eyes on him. Part of her wanted to disappear inside the cabin, avoid this entirely. But the stronger part, the part hammered into shape by 12 months of mountain exile, by frozen mornings and aching joints, and stone laid by hand until her fingers bled, that part stood up straight, squared its shoulders, and waited. Richard climbed out of his car looking somehow smaller than she remembered. The suit was still expensive, but the man inside it had aged. Tired eyes, something diminished in the way he held himself. He stared at the transformed property, and shock moved openly across his face. Everything he'd thrown away like garbage, remade, alive, thriving. "Linda," he said. "Richard." 10 feet of mountain air between them, a year and a lifetime. "I read the article," he managed finally, "about the spring, about the development." "Did you?" It wasn't a question. "Linda, I had no idea the property was valuable. When I gave it to you, I genuinely believed it was worthless." "And if you'd known, you would have kept it." "Yes, of course. The way you kept everything else. That's not fair. I built a career. I earned—" "Stop." Her voice was quiet, firm as bedrock. "Just stop. I don't want to hear it again. You told me everything I contributed was worthless. Fine. You won. You got the house, the money, the young girlfriend. I got the worthless cabin. Quote 49. Quote, we're both happy with how things turned out." Richard shifted his weight, uncomfortable now. "Actually, that's what I wanted to talk about. Carla and we're not together anymore." Linda searched inside herself for a reaction to this news. Satisfaction, sympathy, anything at all. She found nothing. An empty room where emotion should have been. "That's unfortunate." "It is. And the business has been struggling. The real estate market has been difficult. I made some investments that didn't pan out. I'm facing some financial challenges." "I see. And since this property was technically marital property at the time of the divorce, I think there's a case to be made that I'm entitled to a percentage of its current value. My lawyer thinks," quote 56, "Stop," quote 57, "Richard. Listen to what's coming out of your mouth. You gave me this property as a joke, a final slap in the face. You stood in that courthouse and laughed. You handed it over because you thought it was garbage, because you wanted one last chance to make me feel small. And now that I've built something from it, you want your cut. I'm just saying that legally, the divorce is final." Her voice was stone. "The deed is in my name. Whatever this place is worth today exists because of labor I performed, discoveries I made, grants I fought for and earned. You contributed nothing to any of it." Nothing but contempt. Richard's face darkened, color climbed his neck. "Linda, I'm struggling. I need help. After everything. 40 years, Richard. 40 years of running your household so you could chase your career without a single domestic thought crossing your mind. I raised your children. I entertained your clients. I stood behind every decision you ever made, even the ones that cost me. I buried my own ambitions so yours could breathe. And you don't get to stand on my porch now and tell me you're owed something. Quote 64 I gave you a comfortable life. You gave me a cage. And the moment I stopped being young enough, pretty enough, Useful enough. You threw me out like something spoiled. You handed me this cabin because you wanted it to break me. __quote, _65 __. Well, guess what? Richard, you set me free by trying to destroy me. You actually saved me. This place, this worthless property you used as your last weapon, it taught me something I should have learned decades ago. I was never the worthless one. You were. I made a mistake with you, with Carla, with all of it. I see that now. I'm sorry you regret your choices. Linda said it simply, and she meant it. Every word. But your regret isn't my responsibility. I spent 40 years making your comfort my responsibility. I'm done with that. So you won't help me. Help yourself, Richard, the way I had to. Look at me. 64 years old. I haul stone. I run a business. I'm learning things I never dreamed I'd need to learn. Do I get tired? Every single day. Does my body hurt? Every single morning. But I am more alive right now than I ever was inside my marriage. This is not the end of something. This is where it starts. Everyone treats us like we're finished, she said. Her voice cracked. Like once you pass 60, your only job is to fade away quietly. Then don't be quiet, be loud. Be inconvenient. Be so stubborn they can't look away. Refuse to fade. That exchange, raw, unscripted, spoken between two women on a mountain in Colorado, was overheard by a visitor who happened to write a blog. She posted it, and the way things move online, it moved fast. Shared, screenshotted, reshared, discussed in comment sections and group chats and living rooms across the country. Interview requests started arriving, speaking invitations. Women began showing up at the Harrison property with no reservation. Just a suitcase and a question. How do you start over after divorce? Linda hadn't chased any of it. She hadn't wanted attention. She'd wanted to survive, to rebuild. But if her story could reach someone sitting alone in a house that felt like a prison, she would share every word. She started writing. A blog she called Rebuilding at 60-some. Honest, unflinching. She wrote about the ache in her joints after a day of manual labor, about the financial terror of making a fledgling business work with almost nothing, about the silence of mountain isolation, how it presses against you at night, how it tests you. But she also wrote about the other side, the freedom, the fierce, quiet pride of building something that belonged to no one but her, the joy that blooms in exhausted hands. The words landed. Within months, thousands of followers, mostly women past 50, women thinking about divorce, women drowning in divorce, women clawing their way back from divorce. They poured their stories into the comments. They held each other up. They refused, together, to accept the lie that their worth had an expiration date. A community formed, not around Linda's name, around a shared defiance. By her 65th birthday, Linda's life bore no resemblance to anything she'd ever imagined for herself at this age. She lived alone in a mountain cabin she had restored with her own aching hands. She ran a small business. She wrote words that mattered to strangers. She was stronger than she'd been at 30, more independent than she'd been at 40, and, the great irony, more deeply connected to other women than she had ever been in all those suburban years of polite distance. Her children came now, regularly, not out of obligation, out of pride. Michael brought his whole family for spring break. Linda walked her grandchildren through the mineral pools, taught them about water composition and mountain ecology, watched their faces light up the way hers had when she'd first understood what this land could be. Jessica came alone sometimes, quieter visits. She'd sit with her mother in the evening and ask questions Linda had never expected to hear, about marriage, about compromise, about the slow erosion of self. I don't want to end up where you were, quote 82, quote. Neither do I, quote 83, quote, so don't. Don't wait 40 years to demand respect. Don't shrink yourself down so someone else has room to feel big. She smiled. And if you do end up divorced, remember, it might be the best thing that ever happens to you. 2 years after the divorce, a thick envelope arrived in Linda's mailbox. Richard was filing for bankruptcy. His business had crumbled. He was selling the house Linda had kept alive for 4 decades. Her hands had cleaned those floors. Her patience had held those walls together. Part of her felt something, not for Richard, for the house, for what it held. Decades of her life pressed into the walls like dried flowers in a book. Her children's heights penciled on the doorframe. Birthday mornings, ordinary Tuesdays. But mostly what she felt was free. That house had been her cage, beautiful, comfortable, locked from the inside. She didn't want it back. She wanted none of it. Not a single thread from that old existence. That spring, a spa resort company came knocking. They wanted to buy the Harrison property outright. The number they put on the table was staggering, enough to erase every financial worry for the rest of her days, enough to walk away comfortable and never look back. Linda said no, not because the money didn't matter, not because she was foolish, because the property wasn't a thing she owned. It was a thing she'd become. Every repaired board, every stone she'd dragged into place, every morning she'd woken with swollen hands and chosen to keep going, that lived in the walls now. Selling it would be selling the proof that a 65-year-old woman with nothing could build something real, something that breathed, something that was hers alone. But Linda was no fool. The offer gave her something better than a check. It gave her position. She countered with a partnership. The resort company would invest in expanding her facility. In return, they'd receive a minority stake. Linda kept control. Linda kept ownership. But now she had resources, real resources, to grow what her hands had started. By her 66th birthday, the small bathhouse had stretched into a modest spa retreat, still rooted in the history of the land, still run by her personally, her voice in every detail, her eye on every guest, but professional now, and profitable. 8 people from the local community drew paychecks because of what she'd built. 8 families fed, in part, by a woman the world had written off. She'd become something no one, least of all Richard, had ever imagined. A significant local business owner, a town success story, a name people spoke with respect. On quiet evenings, Linda still sat on her porch, the porch she'd rebuilt with her own aching hands. And she let herself think. She thought about the courtroom, Richard's laugh, that careless, dismissive sound, like he was flicking away something that had never mattered. She thought about the woman who'd stood in that courtroom, afraid, diminished, a woman who measured her worth by whether her husband still wanted her. Then she thought about the woman sitting here now, hands scarred from work, back that still protested every morning, but strong, independent, valued, not for what she'd sacrificed, but for what she'd created. The greatest treasure had never been the mineral spring. Linda understood that now in the marrow of her bones. The greatest treasure had been the necessity itself, the stripping away, the forced rebuilding that left her no choice but to discover who she actually was beneath 40 years of compromises, 40 years of shrinking, 40 years of disappearing into someone else's life. Richard had believed he was throwing away garbage. What he'd actually done was cut the rope. Sometimes, Linda thought, the worst things that happen to us arrive wearing the face of disaster. Sometimes being discarded is the first honest act of liberation you've ever received. Sometimes the day your life shatters is the day your real life starts breathing. The sun dropped behind the mountains she now called home. The light went amber, then gold, then deep burning orange against the ridgeline. Linda raised a glass of wine, not to anyone else, to herself, to the cabin, to every bruised morning and frozen night and moment of despair that had brought her to this porch, this view, this life. "Thank you, Richard," she whispered into the evening air, "for underestimating me, for throwing me away, for giving me the greatest gift you ever gave me, the chance to discover I never needed you at all." And she smiled, free, happy, more alive at 66 than she had ever been at 26 or 46. The divorce hadn't been her ending, it had been the lock breaking open. And the cabin Richard had tossed at her like trash, that had been the chest holding her real life. It just needed her hands to open it. It just needed her to claim what had always been hers, herself. If this story touched something in you, leave one word in the comments about what it stirred. And if you've ever had to rebuild after someone tried to break you, share that story, because we are stronger together. We are never too old to begin again. And no one gets to define our worth but us. What they called our ending, life calls our beginning. Hold that close. 3 years after Linda's divorce became final, her life had found a rhythm she couldn't have imagined in her darkest nights. The spa retreat was thriving, booked months in advance. The cabin and grounds had become a destination, written up in travel magazines, featured on wellness blogs, highlighted in historical tourism guides. But for Linda, the real transformation had nothing to do with the property. It lived inside her. She rose every morning before the sun cleared the ridge, made coffee in the kitchen she'd torn apart and rebuilt with her own cracked, calloused hands, stood on the porch she'd restored, board by board, nail by nail, and watched light spill across the mountains. Every inch of this place carried a memory. The floorboard she'd pried up and replaced when termites had eaten through the original. The walls she'd scrubbed until her shoulders burned. The garden she'd planted in soil so rocky she'd had to dig each hole twice. This wasn't property. This was proof. Proof that she could break apart and put herself back together. Proof carved into wood and stone and earth. Her blog had grown into something she never planned, never even imagined. Rebuilding at 60-some, a name she'd chosen half-joking one exhausted night, now reached over 50,000 followers. Women of all ages found it. But the ones who stayed, the ones who read every word and came back week after week, they were the ones over 50. The ones the world had quietly shelved. The ones who'd been told in 1,000 small and brutal ways that their best years were behind them. Linda wrote weekly, practical things, how to patch drywall, how to winterize pipes, how to negotiate with contractors who assumed she didn't know what she was talking about. But also the harder things, aging, independence, the terrifying freedom of having no one left to please, the question that kept her awake some nights: who am I when no one needs me? The comment section became something more than comments. It became a lifeline. Women held each other up in those threads, through divorces that ripped decades apart, through career changes forced on them by employers who wanted younger faces, through empty houses where children's laughter used to echo, through the slow, grinding grief of becoming invisible in a culture that worshipped youth like a religion. One post hit deeper than the rest. Linda had written about the day Richard appeared at her cabin, about his request for money, about the strange, hollow feeling when she turned him away and realized she felt nothing. Not anger, not satisfaction, just nothing. For 40 years, his opinion of me was my opinion of me, she'd written. His approval was my oxygen. His disappointment was my failure. The greatest gift of divorce wasn't the cabin or the spring. It was discovering I could survive, could thrive, without his validation. I spent 62 years believing my worth came from taking care of others. I'm spending my 60s learning that my worth comes from taking care of myself. That post was shared tens of thousands of times. Women wrote to say it gave them the courage to walk out of marriages that had been draining them for decades. Others said it pushed them to start businesses they dreamed about since their 30s. Others said they'd read it at 3 in the morning, crying, and for the first time believed their lives weren't finished. Linda was humbled by every message. She'd never set out to become anyone's inspiration. She had just been trying not to drown. But apparently, the act of refusing to drown, in plain view, without pretending it was easy, was itself the thing people needed to see. The business grew, steadily, not overnight, not through luck or windfall, through labor, through reputation built one guest at a time. Linda hired a manager to handle the daily operations so she could pour herself into the work she loved most, designing new treatments drawn from the mineral water, leading guests through the property's history, sitting with people who arrived carrying weight they couldn't name. Many of the women who came didn't care much about spa treatments. They came because they'd read her story. They wanted to stand where she'd stood, touch the walls she'd rebuilt, see with their own eyes that reinvention after 60 was not a fairy tale someone invented to sell books. It was real. It was standing right in front of them, with swollen knuckles and sun-creased skin and a spine that refused to bend. Linda made time for every one of them. She'd sit on that porch, the one she'd rebuilt, and share coffee and share her story and, more importantly, listen to theirs. Some were freshly divorced, still shaking, still raw, still waking at night reaching for someone who wasn't there. Others hadn't left yet, but were circling the decision like it might burn them. Still others were married, even happily, but felt erased, overlooked, dismissed by a world that treated aging women as inconveniences rather than people. "You're not invisible," _91_society wants you to believe that, because invisible women don't demand their share of resources, of respect, of opportunity. But you are only invisible if you agree to disappear. She'd lean forward, refuse. One afternoon, a woman named Patricia arrived, 71 years old, recently widowed after 50 years of marriage. Her hands trembled when she held her coffee cup. Her eyes were the eyes of someone lost in a house she used to know by heart. "I don't know who I am without him. I was his wife for so long. Now I'm just nobody." Linda sat with that for a moment, let the silence hold it, because she understood that feeling, down to the marrow of her bones. She'd lived inside it. "You're not nobody, __quote_96__. You're someone who devoted 50 years to a partnership. That's not small, that's beautiful. But you're also someone separate, someone with interests and capabilities and dreams that have been waiting, patiently, quietly, for you to turn toward them. It's not too late to find out who that person is." "I started over at 71. "At 62, Linda said plainly. "You're ahead of the game, __quote_100__. Thank you for showing us it's possible." That conversation lodged itself somewhere deep. Linda understood, slowly, that she had become something she never intended. A symbol. Proof. The cabin, the business, the blog, none of it was the point. They were just containers for a truth far bigger than one woman's story, that a woman's life does not end at menopause, does not end at retirement, does not end at divorce or widowhood or the moment the last child stops calling. That 60, 70, 80, these can be beginnings. That reinvention has no expiration date. On the 4th anniversary of her arrival at the cabin, Linda opened the doors wide. She invited her blog readers, local folks, anyone willing to make the drive. Hundreds showed up. The property teemed with women of every age, touring the bathhouse, walking the grounds, sitting in circles on the grass, trading pieces of their lives like gifts they'd been waiting to give someone. Late in the afternoon, Linda stepped onto her porch and faced the crowd. 4 years ago, I came here with nothing. I'd lost my marriage, my home, my identity. My ex-husband handed me this property as a joke, fully expecting me to crumble. And I nearly did. Those first weeks, I cried every single night. I was terrified, alone, absolutely certain I was too old to begin again. But I was wrong. And every woman who has ever been told she's too old, too used up, too far past her prime to build something new, that woman has been lied to. We are not finished at 50 or 60 or 70. We are not done contributing, creating, growing. We are not invisible unless we decide to be. This cabin was supposed to be my humiliation. It became my liberation. And I want every woman standing here to hear me. Whatever you're facing, whatever you've lost, whatever number the calendar assigns to your life, it is not too late. It is never too late to rebuild, to reinvent, to refuse someone else's definition of who you're allowed to be. The applause shook the trees. Women wept, strangled each other in embraces, scribbled phone numbers on napkins and the backs of hands, made promises, real ones, to stay connected. Linda hadn't planned a movement. She'd just survived. But survival, when enough people witness it, becomes a rallying cry. A community of women who refuse to fade away politely. That evening, after the last car wound down the mountain road, Linda's children came. Michael and Jessica, both in their 40s now, settled beside their mother on the porch they'd helped her rebuild during a visit 2 years back. "Mom, you're incredible," quote 103 quote. "How did you do all this?" quote 104 quote. "Honestly, I didn't have a choice." When everything is gone, there are only 2 doors: give up or rebuild. I walked through the second one. But if I'm being truthful, the thing that got me moving in the beginning was rage. 40 years of my life waved away like it never mattered. That fury carried me through the entire first year. After that, something else took its place. Pride, maybe. Stubbornness. The slow, stunned realization that I could actually do this. Do you ever regret it? The divorce, I mean. Do you ever wish Dad had stayed? I regret how it happened, the cruelty of it, the humiliation. I regret all the years I spent making myself smaller than I needed to be. But the divorce itself? No. It set me free to become who I actually am, instead of the version I thought he required. If your father had stayed, I would have grown old inside a comfortable cage. I never would have known I was capable of any of this. Dad called me last week. How is he struggling? Linda nodded slowly. After her children left, Linda sat alone on her porch the way she did most evenings. She thought about Richard, about the man he'd been when they married, about the man he became, about his fall, and her rise. She felt no satisfaction in his unraveling. His pain didn't soothe hers. His failure didn't prove her success. She had learned somewhere along the way that revenge is hollow. The real victory was never his regret. It was her freedom. 4 years she had spent pulling something beautiful from wreckage. She had uncovered a strength she never suspected lived inside her bones. She had built community with women whose paths would never have crossed hers in that old life. She had learned, truly, permanently learned, that her worth did not depend on a single other person's opinion. That alone was enough. That alone was everything. The mountain air turned cold, and Linda moved toward the door. Her door. The one she had repaired with her own hands, reinforced, sanded, painted. She remembered the first time she'd pushed it open, how it crumbled under barely any pressure, how rotten everything had been, the wood, the foundation, her belief in herself. She thought about the woman who had stood on this same threshold 4 years ago, broken, terrified, defeated. That woman no longer existed. In her place stood someone forged by labor and refusal, someone who knew her worth because she had built it, stone by stone, board by board. Someone who had proven to herself that endings could become beginnings, that disasters could become gifts, that discarded women could become empires unto themselves. Linda smiled, stepped inside her cabin, closed the door firmly behind her. Tomorrow she would rise at dawn and begin another day of this reclaimed life. She would work on her business, write her blog, welcome women who came seeking what she had found, healing through their own hands. She would keep building the life she had created from what everyone else called ruins. Because that is what she did now. She built. She created. She refused to vanish. And she would never, ever let another person define her worth again. The cabin Richard had discarded like trash had become a palace. But more important than any structure, the woman he threw away as worthless had discovered she was priceless. That was the real treasure. That was the real transformation. That was the only victory that mattered. 5 years after the divorce, Linda stood before a room packed with women at a conference for female entrepreneurs over 50. They had invited her to speak about her journey, about building a business from nothing, about starting over when the world insists it is too late. She looked out at the audience. Hundreds of faces, all past 50, all carrying their own stories of reinvention, their own scars, their own stubborn refusals to disappear. Gratitude hit her like a wave. "I am 67 years old," she began. "When I was 62, my husband of 40 years told me I was worthless. When I was 62, I lost everything I believed defined me. When I was 62, I was certain my life was over. I was wrong about every single part of that. These last 5 years have been the hardest, the most empowering, the most honest years of my life. I rebuilt a cabin with my own hands. I started a business from an empty bank account and aching joints. I discovered treasure. But the real treasure was never what I found hidden in a wall. It was what I uncovered inside myself. Strength I had no idea existed. Resilience I had never once been forced to test. Worth that never, not for 1 second, depended on someone else's approval. To every woman in this room who has been told she is too old, too late, too far past her prime, I am standing here to tell you, that is a lie. It is never too late. Your life isn't over. It's only now beginning." 5 minutes the audience stayed on their feet. 5 full minutes of applause that rolled through the room like thunder that wouldn't quit. And when it finally faded, women lined up. Not for autographs, not for photos. They lined up to tell her their stories, to ask how she found the strength, to thank a stranger who somehow knew their pain. Linda stood with every single one of them. She listened. She held hands that trembled. She offered whatever hard-won truth she carried, and she marveled, quietly, privately, at what had grown here. Not a business, not a brand, a community, a gathering of women the world had tried to erase. That evening, she drove back up the mountain road alone. Her cabin waited in the dark, warm light spilling from windows she'd reframed with her own swollen fingers. She opened her laptop one last time and wrote, "What Richard called the end, life called my beginning. What he designed as my humiliation became my liberation. What he discarded as worthless became the most precious thing I've ever held. Not because of what I found inside it, because of what I became while building it." To every woman reading these words, you are not finished. Your worth carries no expiration date. Your value does not shrink with every passing year. You are powerful. You are capable. You are worthy. With a partner or without one. With youth or without it. With anyone's approval or standing completely, beautifully alone. Rebuild. Reinvent. Refuse to fade into someone else's story. The best years of your life might still be waiting. Just ahead, just around the corner you haven't turned yet. She published the post, closed the laptop, pushed back from the desk and stepped outside into the night. Mountain air hit her lungs, sharp, clean, alive. Stars burned above her cabin, her palace, her empire, her home. Every stone of it earned, every beam of it placed by hands that ached and kept working anyway. Linda smiled. Not the polite smile she'd worn for 30 years of marriage, a real one, free, full, more herself than she had ever been in her entire life. The divorce hadn't destroyed Linda Harrison. It had stripped away everything false and revealed what was underneath. And what was underneath was magnificent. If Linda's story reached something inside your chest, leave one word in the comments, just one word that holds what you're feeling right now. And remember this, what they called your ending is really your beginning. You are never too old, never too late, never too finished. Start rebuilding.